And joining me now is Tighe Smith, the Chief Nuclear Officer at Paragon Energy. Tighe, thanks for taking the time and coming on the show. The IEA puts nuclear at around 10% of the current global energy mix. They expect that in the next 2 decades, this share will remain flat and could even decline slightly if there is no material pickup in new nuclear projects. In a net zero world, could nuclear displace natural gas as baseload power in grids? What I'm trying to ask is gas and nuclear, do they complement each other, or do they ultimately compete against each other?
Well, it's an important question to think about and answer. Let's address first that 10% figure. And there's a lot of energy forecast models that are out there. You can see a lot of variation of nuclear between 7% and upwards of 25 to 30%, through the next coming decades. So we don't really know what the answer will be yet. We know that nuclear will play an important role in that energy mix. So I think that's an important context. And then the other part of that equation is that even if nuclear remains relatively flat at 10%, net nuclear energy will be growing because energy usage and energy demand is growing. So even to pace with a 10% of energy coming from nuclear, to keep pace with that, we have to add new nuclear capacity across the world. So then to address the second part of your question, what is the kind of the competitive situation between nuclear and natural gas? For at least for the next decade, anything that we're doing to address reduction of carbon emissions is a net positive gain for net zero, right? We are gaining and gaining on the challenge ahead of us, which is reduction of carbon, reduction of CO2. And so natural gas plays a critical role in that in the coming years. Over the long term, though, natural gas have to figure out a way to capture the carbon that they're producing. True. And then the market has to price that capacity to capture carbon into the price of natural gas. We have not seen that yet. And that's an important part of the equation that is not yet priced into the market. And so I do think that over the longer term, natural gas and nuclear begin to compete as the price of carbon capture is priced into the electrical market. We see natural gas, the cost of electricity generation from natural gas increase because of that. Then nuclear and natural gas are much more competitive with each other. Today, at least for baseload electricity that can be generated quickly, natural gas does win that equation. But that doesn't price in the cost of carbon capture.
Tighe, according to some sources, nuclear power declined in 2022 by around 4% to a 4-decade low. Cost overruns and delays have plagued the nuclear industry for the last couple of decades. So can we even discuss a bigger role for nuclear moving forward? How can the industry rise up to these challenges?
Well, that's an important thing that we need to address and be honest about. Certainly in the United States, we've seen cost overruns in recent nuclear projects. I'm proud to say that we completed those projects in the United States. They were not easy to complete. And the good news is they're going to provide baseload power for citizens of Georgia and Alabama, for the next 60 years. So the AP1000 projects, even though they were were expensive, they're operating. They will provide a great source of baseload power. But to address, kind of the elephant in the room, which is, all right, how do we do this more cost effectively? I think there's some really interesting models that are coming out of the innovations with small modular reactors and advanced reactors, where we're looking at a combination of industrial partners. For instance, X-Energy and Dow are looking at a partnership at the Seadrift site for Dow to help construct and operate ultimately an X100 plant in that location in Dow. And they're wanting to do that because they need to reduce their CO2 emissions, and they need access to the high temperature steam. And the interesting thing that Dow brings to that equation is a lot of experience in large capital projects. The same is true when you look at a company like NuScale and Intra1, where you have a developer that has a lot of experience building out large capacity nuclear projects or large capacity projects in general. So those are important parts and important facets of this equation, which is how do we take the nuclear technology piece, which is critical, right? The ability to build the reactor, to design it safely, make sure it operates well, make sure it operates efficiently, with the ability to build large capital-intensive projects. I don't think that any nuclear company really has a complete answer for that in the United States. It's going to take partnerships to make these things more cost-effective. The other thing that has to happen, and I think we've seen this in other jurisdictions, such as in China or in South Korea, once you start to build that momentum and you have some of these projects, kind of under your belt, you understand it, you have the labor force that you need to execute well, you have the understanding from the regulator on what the technology is. Once you kind of get those pieces together and you get that recipe working well, then you're able to repeat that much more effectively and much more cost effectively. So some of this is, how do we get the momentum to keep these projects moving forward and keep that momentum for the coming decades? That's where at the point we're at today. We need to get over some humps. We need some help from both our regulators in the United States, our federal partners, to continue to fund and assist our private, these private companies to get these mega projects started and completed.
How well suited is nuclear to play a significant role in producing clean hydrogen in the future, Tighe? Could utilities, in order to maintain stable nuclear power production, swing its power between the grid and the actual hydrogen production?
The great answer is that nuclear is extremely well suited from a technical standpoint to produce hydrogen. We produce electricity, right? And we have that electricity capacity 95% of the time. Then we also produce high temperature steam or high temperature gas, depending on the reactor type, such that we're able to operate electrolysis at its optimal temperature and as efficiently as possible. So that's the good news. The good news is that from a hydrogen production standpoint, nuclear seems to be an ideal technology for that. The other part of the equation is nuclear power plants are most cost efficient when they operate continuously. So you want once you load fuel, you would like that reactor to operate for a continuous 18 months to 24 months. But you have variation in demand. We have a lot of variation in demand between the daytime and the nighttime when people are sleeping versus when they're working. And so the cost, the electrical spot price varies. And because of that variance in electrical spot pricing, you may be more cost efficient in the production of hydrogen instead of selling your electricity to the grid. And the great news about hydrogen is it allows a nuclear power plant operator the flexibility to produce an additional asset, right? They're producing hydrogen instead of producing electricity, and they can make some choices about what's their most profitable venture in the moment, right? And they're able to swing that capacity relatively quickly. So it gives them an important option. I think that improves their ability to adapt to different power purchase agreements, adapt to the changing electrical prices on the grid, and produce ultimately the highest return to their shareholders. We need these plants operating not just safely and efficiently, we also want them operating profitably. And a profitable operation that involves hydrogen, I think, is in the future for nuclear. There are 3 pilot projects here in the United States. And as far as I know, those projects are going as planned. So we're going to have a pretty good understanding here in the next couple of years what hydrogen production looks like from nuclear power plants, how cost effective it is, and then ultimately, does it make sense to deploy across the larger fleet of 90 plus reactors here in the U.S.?
Does the nuclear industry, Tighe, stand to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act? And does a mature 7-decade-plus-old nuclear industry still need that government support? I know you've touched upon that subject earlier, but maybe we need to highlight how important the government support is, especially as some people see that the time window for the nuclear industry to rise up to these challenges is narrowing.
Yeah, I want to first say I am not a tax expert, and I try hard not to ever become one. So some of this is still playing out, right? There are still parts of the Treasury regulations that I don't think are quite clear for nuclear. But the Inflation Reduction Act does, contain some very important pieces of legislation that we think changes the equation for nuclear. It allows us to. It not only is for for nuclear power plants, but also for hydrogen production. Sure. So it contains both of those pieces. Yeah, I think it's a fair question to say, why does something that our first nuclear reactor operated in December 1942, under the squash court there at the University of Chicago. So we've been at this for a while. So why do we need that support? I think the real reason is that the value proposition for nuclear has changed. Our technology is changed with that. And what we have to think about is with those changing market dynamics and the fact that these nuclear power plant assets have operated for a long time, are their benefits really reflected in their pricing? And that's where I think they're trying to normalize, at least to some extent, the base load capacity part of the equation with these tax subsidies, right? They're trying, the federal government is saying, look, nuclear power plants provide, 24/7 power. They're not dependent on, the weather for the most part, they are not dependent at all on weather for operation. And so that is an important part of the equation over the long term to provide a very stable grid. Now, most power plants are awarded based on the electrical pricing we kind of already talked about. But when you get to reliability, that's more of a community benefit, right? It's something that is more intangible. It is something that I think the federal government and state governments and even local jurisdictions, they play a role in assuring that local communities have access to power regardless of the weather. In fact, you could argue it's more important when you're in an event that either creates you have a snow or ice or wind or problems that are with weather that are creating unstable electrical supplies. That's when your electrical infrastructure is at its most critical point. That's when you need it the most. And so a lot of this work from a policy perspective is just to normalize normalize nuclear power plant production as its pricing as an asset to communities. And IRA is reflective of that. It's reflective of the priorities of a more stable grid. And I think that, in the long term, nuclear has to stand on its own merits. But in order to do that, it needs to be compared against things that are, natural gas that captures carbon or coal-fired plants that are capturing carbon. And I'm not here to argue that those two technologies can't be part of net zero. They certainly can be. We just have to understand how much it costs for them to capture their carbon and put it into the ground and how effective that technology is. And once you have all of those levelized costs understood, we shouldn't need any additional support from the federal government to make nuclear power plants as cost effective in that market. Once once it truly shows the benefit of or the cost of carbon capture and zero carbon energy.
Tighe Smith, Chief Nuclear Officer at Paragon Energy, thank you very much for joining us on the show and for shedding some light on the future opportunities and challenges facing the nuclear industry. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Great to be here.